Time. Okay. Microphone need. Alrighty. Ooh. Okay, happy Friday. Hope everyone is doing all right. Okay, so we are going to keep going with. Just want to see if I what's. Okay. Someone. Too dark. Way too dark. What is happening? Okay, better. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna get going here. I want to try and get through as much as possible with family today. If we have time for education, I doubt we will, but I do want to kind of move through it and try and get into what I think is the juicy stuff. Which is work, sex and intimacy, and religion as quickly as possible. Okay. I'm not. Okay. I will. For some of the questions on the exam, are you able to explain more within lecture of concept? Lecture material didn't have enough info to answer questions. I don't think that's true, but I don't think that's true. I mean, if you're just looking at the slides, that's probably true. If you have a problem with some of the questions, once I am done marking the exam, you can definitely come in and you can have a chat with me about it. I mean, I think I presented just an enormous amount of material. But okay, I guess without knowing the ouch, ouch. Sorry, that's harsh. I just want to note that I didn't say that. That was someone else. That is one of your peers throwing shade at you. I'm sorry. Your peers are so mean. I will. Yeah, I mean, okay. Next midterm, can I please make the wording more clear? Yeah, okay. I will. If you again, and if you want to come and talk with me about the wording of the question, happy to sort of discuss that. I tried to make them as clear as possible, while also not making it super easy for some of the chat bots out there to just go and find the information on the web and answer the question. So I will try. I mean, as we get further into the course, the less changes I make, the more battle tested the questions are. So the questions for the next part are pretty, like, in terms of I've used them before, so they're pretty well battle tested. But I don't try to make the questions unclear. Sometimes it might happen. Yeah, for this one, I just don't know. I feel like I covered so much in such depth. But if you have a specific problem with a specific question, I'm happy to chat about it once I get them marked, right? Once I get them graded, I'm happy to chat with you about that. All right. Okay. Yeah, I'm hoping to have those done sometime next week. At the latest. I like some of you. I had multiple exams and multiple classes come in this week, so I'm like trying to triage stuff as quickly as I can. I got most of an exam marked yesterday, and this afternoon I'm kind of hoping to finish that one, and then hopefully I'll have a lot of time next week, especially on Tuesday, just to like dig in and get everything that I can possibly get marked. Depending on what my weekend looks like, I might try and sneak off on either Saturday or Sunday and go do a bunch of work, try to get things marked so that people get their results back as quickly as possible. There's just 103 of you in the class, and that's 5 answers each. So it's a lot of reading for me to do to get things marked properly. So it takes a little bit of time, but I'm hoping to have it done for you before you leave on reading week. Possibly Friday at 4 p.m. to really ruin your reading. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure you'll all do fine. I'm sure you'll all do fine. I have total faith in you. Okay. So, what were we talking about last time? We're talking about families, and we talked about some different parenting styles. Some of the changes in family structure, parenting styles, and how they can affect life outcomes a little bit, and then. I guess we ended off with, just the shocking revelation that, better parenting tends to lead to better outcomes. And especially the more you are towards that authoritative parenting and, closer bonds between parents and children, the less room there is for people to drift into antisocial behavior. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about gender here and the way gender is socialized. And obviously, when we're talking about our youngest cohorts, our millennials and Gen Z, obviously there's a lot of changes that have happened in terms of kind of gender socialization and understandings of gender. And I think one of the things that's probably shifted the most is that it's sort of postmodernist, or like conflict theory combined with feminist kind of view of gender has come to be essentially the one that's dominant amongst Gen Z and a good chunk of millennials as well. And again, despite most of them having never read, Judith Butler or anything like this, any of the kind of cores of gender or queer theory, it lives deeply within them. It's been, perpetuated and propagated through culture and through socialization at various levels. And so this is sort of the view, I think, that predominates now. The gender is socially constructed. And if you remember, we went back to, if you think back to Christian Smith, right, and the findings from the National Study of Youth and Religion, especially about the cultural world of millennials, right? Millennials and Gen Z are deeply socially constructivist, right, in their orientation and understanding of the world. And again, despite the fact that I'm sure most of them have never read, say, Peter Berger or any of the kind of foundational thinkers in social construction, this idea that something like gender or gender roles are all socially constructed has deeply taken hold within these generations, right? Okay, so what kind of ideas do we have, right? Well, feminists typically started the argument with the notion that gender was socially constructed and that this was an ongoing process, right? That gender socialization isn't something necessarily that ever ends, right? That it's an ongoing process through life, that we are always, quote unquote, doing gender, right? That it's an ongoing process that's constant. And it starts very young, right? I guess in certain cases, it starts before the child is born, right? Now we do gender reveal parties where people attempt to blow themselves or their neighbors up with increasingly insane stunts that are either pink or blue in their explosive potential. I think my favorite was the Brooklyn Nine-Nine episode where they tried to do a gender reveal and somehow they ended up with green, so everyone was very confused. Anyway, right? And what essentially like doing gender would mean in a situation like that, right, is that the moment you find out what the sex of the baby is, right, you start the gendering process, right? You start buying pink things with little unicorns on them, or blue things with tractors, right? And you start kind of building in those stereotypes of what being male or female, masculine or feminine mean, right? And you start to sort of condition both, parents and then the children once they're here with certain expectations, right? Basically you present sort of typical gender norms to children in various ways, right? Through play, through the roles that parents take up in the household, how you treat them, how you interact with them, what kind of activities you sign them up for, and all of these sorts of things are all for feminists, especially critical feminists, part of this process of essentially passing on what they would see as repressive gender norms that privilege patriarchy and disempower women in lots of ways, right? And all sorts of ways that this gets passed on, right? In play, even in the types of household chores that people are given, right? It's more typical that female children are given more domestic chores like cleaning, taking care of younger children, whereas male children are more often given physical tasks, right? Mowing the lawn, clearing the snow, taking out the garbage, and these sorts of things. My children don't do anything, no matter how many times I tell them, so I'm not sure what that's teaching them or what kind of gender norms I'm passing on. I'm like, you, boy, do your laundry. I don't want to. I lose again. Minecraft is more interesting than folding underwear for some reason. I can't explain it. Okay, so this is a video that came out a few years ago from the BBC. I think it kind of well encapsulates the basics of this sort of way of thinking of how gender is passed on, even from a very early age, and how that affects people going through life. And we talk about education. Oops, that's playing on my headphones. That's not what I want. Everything's falling apart again. Okay. See if I can adjust this really quickly. Otherwise, I gotta turn my headphone off for a sec. I need my sound settings. Output is, I hope, that one. I know how Windows works.
Look at this. Look at me. Do you like a dolly? Should we go for the dolly? There's a good girl. You're a good little girl, aren't you, Sophie? Look, what does this say? Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams. Miss Sophie. Meow, meow. I think she liked that pink dolly the best.
If I were to tell you actually that Sophie is Edward,
Does
that change anything?
I maybe thought, oh, this is a little girl, so I have to give her little girl things.
Solo. Solo. Hello. Hello. Come on.
What's this one? What's that one do? Is that a robot? What about this? You like that one? What does this one do? Oliver.
You've gone for, you could say, boy toys for this boy.
Possibly in my subconscious, but for me, I was just going for what was around me, but then perhaps my subconscious was automatically playing a trick on me. That I was...
If I tell you that he is actually a girl.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I suppose it's because of the stereotype.
And then that changed your behaviour towards the child.
It did.
And your behaviour was quite
it
directive.
Did. 1, 2, 3. Ah. Beep, 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 beep. Do you want to see my robot?
She's picked up the robot, the car, the puzzle game. And I think she's been much more physical in handling the child than the other adults have been with girls.
That really astounded me because I thought that I was somebody that had a really open mind.
Surprise. So I automatically went for the pink fluffy toy because I said it was a girl, so I was sort of stereotyping.
I've always thought I was rather more open-minded than that, and I would think, you know, these are children's toys, whatever the gender.
It will make me think the next time I'm with a child, so my niece or my nephew, to make sure that I am actually being sort of fair and equal with all of them, and just giving each child an opportunity to just be whoever they are.
Okay, so obviously, I mean, don't take that as definitive. I just think that's the kind of argument that feminists typically are making, right? That gender comes from these deep kind of social ways that we teach people, to be in the world, right? Yeah, amongst other things, right? We have different expectations of boys and girls. Boys, especially once we get to adolescence, tend to be granted more independence. Girls, especially, and this is more true, say, in kind of more traditional families, right? And especially families like first generation immigrants, this is much more typical that girls have independence more limited in the name of protection. We tend to give people roles that in childhood that closely simulate kind of the adult roles that we expect people to have. So, okay. The kind of, I guess, philosophy that this sort of, the kind of the feminist view, that gender is entirely a social construct, is essentially kind of a reaction in some ways to what was, I think, held up as the kind of normative view up until probably the 1990s, right? That it was sort of the socially accepted kind of view that basically that there were core characteristics of gender that were tied to biology. As people developed, a better understanding of the body and the brain, right? This got, tied to, brain structures and particularly the effects of hormones on the brain, right? So testosterone for men, estrogen and progesterone for women, right? So you can call this view the gender essentialist view, right? Or gender essentialism. And this has been, I think, how people mostly understood, the broad characteristics of kind of males and females, what was masculine and feminine historically, right? Until really recently, until this kind of social constructivist view really took over, as the millennials were entering kind of adolescence and emerging adulthood. And before that, this was a much more normative view. Okay, so yeah, it tends to construct females as more nurturing, mothering, social and emotional, and view men as more aggressive, competitive, and having greater spatial awareness, right? it's a pretty conservative, and traditional view of gender roles, and has tended to, and you see this still sometimes in say conservative, especially I think religious circles, that anything outside of that kind of binary ultimately can be problematic, right? That it's somehow abnormal. Now, that said, there's reasons that this view has existed and predominated, historically, amongst which are, the fact that, and as Bibby, so Bibby was Reginald Bibby, a sociologist at the University of Lethbridge, in kind of Canadian sociology circles. He's something of a legend, especially for his work around sociology of religion. But he's sort of a polymath when it comes to sociology in general. And one of the things that he noted was that this view of kind of gender essentialism fundamentally is based on the fact that when we look at kind of gendered patterns of behavior and interest, they're remarkably consistent, right? It's much more common, for example, for women to value relationships than it is for men. Even in terms, and we'll talk about this when we get to kind of education and work, in terms of their kind of interests and what they kind of are interested in, there seems to be a sort of majoritarian inclination for males to go into certain professions and females to go into different kinds of professions, right? So if we look at, say, teaching, nursing, and social work, they remain dominated by women. And this actually, what's kind of weird about it is that in extremely egalitarian societies, so if we look at the Scandinavian countries, which are probably the most egalitarian in terms of their views of kind of sex and gender and all of these things, the split between, women going into what we call the compassionate or pink collar professions and men going into STEM fields is actually wider than it is in less egalitarian places like the United States. So there does seem to be an inclination for women to be more interested in certain things and men to be more interested in certain things as well. I mean, if you look at, say, construction trades, what was it that I saw the other day? And it was one of my good friends is a plumber. 98% of plumbers are men. And I, frankly, the stories he tells me about wading, ankle deep in other people's shit, suggest to me why that's probably the case, right? He's like, yeah, I was in this flooded basement and there's crap floating around. And I'm like, you have a delightful job. I'm so jealous. I'm jealous. Anyway, flooded basements and backed up water or sewer lines are not the most fun. But right, 98% of plumbers are men. Like 96% of construction workers are men. Right, there do seem to be these different places that the genders have different inclinations to go into, and so a lot of the sort of like partially observed, like if you were not paying that close of attention, and you didn't see the edge cases, you would think women are mostly this and men are mostly this. And that's where this kind of gender essentialist view comes from, right? I mean, women tend to value interpersonal traits like honesty, politeness, empathy, and generosity more than men do. Women on the whole, though, again, it's not universal, are not as interested in sports as men are. There certainly are women who are interested in sports. But, if we were to take a poll, I suspect that more men will know what two teams are playing in the Super Bowl of the ball that's shaped like an egg that's happening this weekend. I know one of them has Taylor Swift's boyfriend and the other one doesn't. That's as much as I know. So hey, not all men are interested in sports either. I got invited to a Super Bowl party this weekend and I was like, right, football. What are the rules of this game again? Throw ball, drink beer, sit around for 45 minutes while they set the next play. I will pass on this sport, thank you. All right, anyway, women on the whole tend to be a little bit more concerned with social justice and social issues than men are. And this one is actually interesting because it's actually kind of flipping now. Or more so, women are kind of coming even with men in terms of their indifference towards religion, but that's a relatively recent trend. Historically, women were more religious and spiritual than men were, right? So again, this is not to say that this essentialist view is true, but as Bibby kind of notes, right, it made sense for people who weren't paying that close of attention historically to especially sort of the people who are liminal in terms of gender, right? Those who are, I guess, who are divergent, who we would have called deviant in the past, that people weren't paying that close of attention to those people and mostly saw that these broad trends held true. And so they were like, yeah, this is what men are, this is what women are. And, because most people only make casual observations about the world, it's easy to see how this view can predominate and be kind of normalized. And we still see it, right? You still have the, what's his name? Beard, glasses. Matt Walsh, right? Is that right? Matt Walsh, one of the guys at Daily Wire, who will make these sorts of very broad claims. Oh God, I'm gonna get on Ben Shapiro's bad side, and someone's gonna yell at me, and they're gonna be like, "This professor from Canada saying bad things about the Daily Wire. Now we're going to destroy him." Okay, or something. Actually, I don't know. That's my Ben Shapiro impression. It's as good as it's gonna be. I did listen to his rap song. I don't know why, because I saw it on YouTube and it was kind of funny, actually. Okay. Shh. I never reuse videos from SOS 100, but yes, I use that video in SOS 100 too. Okay, so the last kind of view on gender that I do want to talk about is, not so much the fully socially constructed one or the fully essentialist one, but a sort of middle view. And I think this one was probably popular kind of around the mid 2000s, right? So around 2004, 2005. This was kind of the way things were trending before really millennials and Gen Z sort of swooped in and moved everything to that social constructionist view. And this is, I think probably the avatar and the person I've seen who talks about this, not the most, but in the most consistent terms, is Dr. Leonard Sachs, who's a really interesting character, right? Really focused on education in particular. And, he has an MD, he's a pediatrician and a degree in child psychology, right? A PhD in child psychology. So a really interesting guy. And his books are really, really interesting in lots of ways. And he brings lots of interesting kind of research. And basically the way that this view is typically articulated is that there are aspects of, gender which are socially constructed, right? Beauty standards, for example, are entirely socially constructed. And we know this from the fact that they, vary a ton from age to age, right? From historical period to historical period. And this, if you look at like Renaissance or Romantic era paintings of, nude women, right? They're very curvy and plump, specifically because that was what was valued in terms of beauty at the time, right? People who had a little bit of extra weight were seen as healthy. They had a lot of food, so that's what a beauty standard was. Now, it's more, the size 2 kind of body for different reasons. So a lot of things like beauty standards, the way we dress, the way people do their hair is all socially constructed. But what Sachs will say is there's also kind of broad trends that are linked to biology and specifically things like interests. And he's really interested. It's in, I think it's in this book. It's Why Gender Matters. This is the old version. He did a revised version of it a couple of years ago, which I never reread, but I've heard him do interviews on it a few times. And one of the things that's interesting is that we find broad differences in sort of interests and, well, how to put this, interests and kind of styles of play and action in all forms of primates. And the one that he really focuses on is a study that was done of rhesus monkeys, just to see what kind of toys male and female rhesus monkeys were interested in playing with. Male rhesus monkeys, he said, were more interested in playing with trucks and things that move, and female rhesus monkeys were more interested in playing with, soft toys. And, this is often a study that's been held up as a kind of proof that there are some kind of differences based on kind of brain development and hormonal trends in all primates, because, rhesus monkeys don't have language, so they can't socially construct anything. And yet we see these broad kind of patterns of action versus nurturing in male and female primates across the board, and more so in lower primates. Okay. So yeah, there do seem to be certain things, kinetics tend to be more interesting to men than they are to women, whereas, emotions and interpersonal connections are more attractive to women in a lot of ways, right? And again, there's lots of divergence within a population, if you're just talking about, if you look at a bell curve, the fat part of the bell curve, right, tends to have broadly shared patterns. I mean, one of the things I will say, he's an interesting fellow. One of the things that Sachs advocated really strongly was that, if you wanted to interest girls, he's talking about early education, girls in STEM fields, that it's probably better to take sort of different approaches than you would with men. And he noted that a lot of physics lessons, early in kind of like science 10 or whatever, was like 2 cars are hurtling at each other on the highway, or 2 football players are running at each other and they impact how much force, right? If this person was this much, and that these examples were less interesting to girls than they were to boys. And something like a Fibonacci sequence, which is a kind of mathematical principle, was much more interesting to girls in general than, examples based on race cars or football were for teaching something like physics. And he advocated, right, that we should have a different approach, because if we want girls to be involved in STEM, and I think we do, sometimes the way we introduce it can be off-putting if it doesn't appeal to them on a basic level. So they're really interesting books. His later books kind of focused on mental health amongst girls and boys, and we'll talk about that as we go forward as well. Okay. There's distinct class-based differences when it comes to ideas of gender equality as well. Not surprisingly, when we talk about middle and upper class families, they have greater ideas about gender equality, right? They're more likely to have attended university, right? They're more likely to be able to kind of articulate it. Whereas if you look at working class and poor families, they tend to have much more traditional kinds of ideas about gender roles, right? And again, this may be down to education, although even now we're seeing kind of this socially constructed notion bubbling down as it becomes part of the general culture. All right. Okay. Everyone wanted to talk about the exam at the beginning. No one has any questions. Okay. Generation gap. We talked about it a little bit, when we talked about the different generations. It seems to be, and I think Twenge's kind of argument with the generation gap is that it's broadly based on different understandings and different kind of technological milieus that people were raised in, and changes in the way people communicate and understand things, right? In general, if we think about a generation gap, young people tend to see their difficulties communicating with their parents as being greater than their parents see it, right? Parents tend to have what's called the generational stake. Basically, you're invested as a parent, you're invested in your children, right? You see them in some senses as an extension of yourself, right? And part of it is, you've invested a ton of emotional, financial, and just like physical energy into getting your children from, baby to adolescent or emerging adult, right? So it matters enormously to you how they are doing in life. Children, on the other hand, do not have as much of a generational stake. Their connection with their parents is much less. I mean, it's still important. The relationship with your parents is amongst the most important in your life, and always will be, with obviously a few exceptions. But especially as young people are going through adolescence, that developmental stage, they're going through a period of differentiation, right? And very natural, where the focus is more on separating from their parents and establishing their own individual identities and their own path through life. And so when these things kind of come about, exacerbated by the fact that, my children want to communicate almost entirely in memes, and I'm like, that's dumb. And they're like, you just don't get it. And I'm like, you're right, I don't get it. Can you teach me? They're like, no. Like, okay. Or the fact that my son enjoys watching other people play Minecraft on YouTube, a phenomenon that is, to me, so unbelievably alien. I'm like, why don't you just play Minecraft? He's like, you don't get it. I'm like, no, that's the problem. I don't get it. Why? Well, I'm learning to be an influencer. I'm like, stop it. I hate this. I hate it so much. Anyway, it's but this is I'm describing in humorous terms from my own life. Essentially, this idea. There's a generational gap, right? There's a generational gap in technology and the place of technology in their lives, right? And added to the fact that they're trying to establish their own identities, this causes difficulty in communicating between the generations, right? There's also what I think would be called a cultural script. And Christian Smith talks about this. I think he talks about it particularly in a book called Soul Searching, which was part of the early research in National Study of Youth and Religion, that there is a cultural script with regard to adolescents, that they are, I think as he puts it, they're treated almost as an alien species, right? One that is emotionally unstable and problematic. And parents, for whatever reason, we have this kind of cultural idea that adolescents are, A, unreachable, B, they don't want anything to do with their parents in a lot of cases, and that putting in norms and rules ultimately leads to resentment and rebellion, right? Not so much that it leads to thriving. So kind of the opposite of what we think about. We talk about, what authoritative parenting is. There is a cultural script that says that authoritative parenting, one that's limiting or puts boundaries, will ultimately lead to rebellion. And this is all over a bunch of different literatures, right? One of the key fears that parents have is that putting too many rules and expectations on will lead their children to rebel and ultimately reject their parents. Because I don't know if it's for whatever reason, this is part of the cultural kind of understanding of what adolescence is. It's a time of rebellion, right? Even though, if you look at the statistics, most teenagers are very conventional and really try to walk a very careful line between remaining true to what their parents kind of believe and value and what their friends believe and value, right? And there's always this kind of back and forth between peers and parents and trying to walk that line. There's very, when we think of teenage years as a time of rebellion, teenagers are surprisingly conventional and really, really conformist in most ways, right? Most teenagers just want to get along with both their peers and their parents, right? And they will go to great lengths to do both things, right? Teenagers really don't want to stand out for the most part. There are, of course, again, exceptions that you can probably think of, but most of the time, teenagers are just trying to get along with as many people as possible. Okay. I love this cat. He's my favorite for today. All right. I still have many years before empty nest syndrome becomes a problem for me. And I don't have a cat, so never can my wife torment a cat by knitting his sweater. I would never knit. I have big, chunky meat fingers that don't do small tasks well. Okay, so leaving home, right, and the empty nest. This has been sort of the ideal, right? And in a lot of ways, this is established by the silent generation, by the baby boomers, both of whom, right, basically had the opportunity to essentially enter adulthood, right, at around 18 to 22, very quickly get good jobs, and then move on to establish their own lives as adults in very, very concrete ways. And I mean, so leaving home, for people, especially kind of European descent, is an expected norm. It gets a little bit different if you look at, different kinds of ethnic and racial groups. They often have different sorts of expectations around leaving home. I know I had a student who, her family was Lebanese last year in one of my classes, and just in talking to her, she was like, yeah, that's absolutely not how we do things in our community. It's like, you will be at home until you get married, and then, if it's at 22, great. If it's at 42, great. You're still going to be living at home with your parents. So obviously there's some variance here as well. But yeah, typically, we think of this kind of transition out of the parental home as coming along with big life transitions. Things like graduation used to be from high school. Increasingly now it's university or college, marriage, or whatever it happens to be, right? However, as the average age of marriage rises, young people are no longer so much leaving home to get married, but often either to live alone with peers, or in a decreasing number of cases, to live with a romantic partner, right? Cohabitation still happens, but it's on the same decline as marriages in general. So yeah, the cat. I love him. Another phenomenon that's increasingly common are what are called boomerang kids or Velcro kids. They're slightly different in what they are, right? So the boomerang kids, like a boomerang, you throw it and it comes back. Basically, are adult children who leave home and then return. And obviously, this can happen numerous times. Or Velcro children, those who are stuck in the parental home, like Velcro. So they have to sort of be peeled off, or they just stay forever. And yeah, I mean, it's just becoming increasingly common that adult children leave and come back more times, and especially in places where the cost of housing, in particular, has gotten higher and higher. It's becoming more and more common that people, leave home and return, or are unable to leave home well into kind of emerging adulthood because of the enormous cost of living, right? Okay. Yeah, if we look, oh, yeah, sorry, Mia, go ahead. Well, both, I mean more that both the silents and the boomers, right, when they got to that kind of cusp of adulthood, they left, right? So they moved out at a very young age and never returned, right? Because they established their own households, right? They got married, they established their own households, and they were gone from their parental homes. So their parents, became empty nesters, right? They had no children at home at a very young age, right? Or much sooner than, say, the parents of the millennials or Gen Z. My 14-year-old, I told her once she moves out, whenever that is, I'm 100% turning her bedroom into an office. And she's like, you can't do that. I'm like, why? You'll be gone. She's like, yeah, but it'll still be my room. I'm like, interesting. That's strangely possessed. So I'm convinced she's never fully moving out. That's what she's going to do. Just leave half her stuff in my house forever. And that's okay too. Okay. So, sorry, did I answer your question, Mia? Okay, great. Yeah, in 2011, right? So that was one of not the last big census, but the census before that. We had about 64% of males and 55% of females between 20 and 24 living at home. 59% overall, and that was up substantially from 1981, right? So that would have been when the oldest part, or so the youngest part of the boomers and the youngest part of Gen X were kind of coming into emerging adulthood. Yeah, 42.3% of the 4.3 million young people aged 20 to 29 live at home, right? So less than that youngest cohort, which a lot of college age people in 20 to 24. Little change from 2006, but up significantly from 1991, right, where it was 32%, right? So 32% in 1991 of 20 to 29-year-olds lived at home, and way up from 1981 when it was just over a quarter, right? So this trend of emerging adults living at home with their parents is growing, as time goes forward. So it's getting worse and worse over time. It was in 1981. So all that suggests, what we know about these places, right, is that Alberta, the Yukon, and Saskatchewan are all relatively inexpensive, especially if we talk about it. I thought this was a different slide than the next one. That's okay. Yeah, so a third living with parents. It's increased since 2001. And yeah, basically, like a concomitant change, fewer young adults or emerging adults are living with their own family, right? So in households that they have established, particularly with their own children, which decreased from 41% in 2001. It's decreased. The share of young adults living with their own family decreased about half, or 49.1% to 41.9%. So, in this period of essentially 15 years from 2001 to 2016, not surprisingly, this is exactly when millennials are coming into their emerging adult years. We've seen a big decline in the number of emerging adults who are establishing their own household. So, and again, that range is pretty wide. 20 to 34 is a wide. Yeah, in a smaller proportion in general of young adults are now living with children, either as part of a couple or a lone parent family, or without their parents present. So it's like not living with your own kids and also living with your parents, which sounds horrifying. Yeah, so it's basically a decrease from 32.9% in 2001 to just over a quarter in 2016, right? And this, goes along with the fact that fewer people are having children in that age category, right? It's now ranging into the top end of that age range where women in particular are having their first child. It's about 28. And for men, it's well into the 30s when their first child is born. More than 2 in 5 young adults in Ontario are living with their parents, the largest proportion in Canada, and up significantly from the 20.3% that it was in 2001. Why might this happen? And I was looking at these slides before class, and it got the song about hating Toronto stuck in my head. I hate the Sky Dome and the CN Tower too. I hate Nathan Phillips Square in the Ontario Zoo. The rent's too high, the air's unclean, the beaches are dirty, and the people are mean. Sounds right about Toronto to me. I've only been to Toronto like 5 times, and I've never really loved it. That's okay. Okay, so if we look at the major metropolitan areas in Canada, Toronto and Oshawa have the largest shares of young adults living with parents, almost half of them, right? Almost 1 in 2. So yeah, basically you got Toronto, Oshawa, and then, Hamilton. So you kind of look, you've got the GTA. Right? Oh, sorry, I took this from Statistics Canada, which is why it said chart 2. So you got the GTA, Hamilton, Windsor, Barrie, St. Catharines, and Brantford, right? So all of those places have significant numbers of young adults living with their parents, and that was as of 2016, I believe. So I suspect this number has gone up. The 4 other CMAs with total populations of 1 million or more all had shares of young adults living with their parents lower than the national average. So Montreal, Ottawa, Gatineau. Although I understand, I suspect since 2016, Ottawa, Gatineau would fall off that list because Gatineau has gotten, Ottawa, Gatineau has gotten extremely expensive from what I understand. Calgary and Edmonton, right, come in basically with the best numbers. Again, only about a quarter of emerging adults. So hey, if you're going to live anywhere and you don't want to live with your parents, Calgary, Edmonton seems to be the place. And yeah, almost 70% of those living at home reported they never left their parents' home, right? So they've been living there among those aged 25 to 29, so a little bit older. It's only about a quarter. And again, for those 30 to 34, it's 8.6%. So all have left home, and if they're living with their parents now, it's because they've had to come back for some reason, right? So I will say, I think this is the last slide in the deck, so it's a good place to kind of stop for the week. But I will say the economics here definitely plays a role, right? It's long been true that the more expensive housing is, the more difficult it is for young people to get established, even to pay rent, right? And we've seen, obviously, in Canada, a massive spike in the cost of living, especially around housing, and especially in the GTA and Southern Ontario, right? This is where rents and mortgages have gone completely insane, driven by a combination of easy money, cheap money, low interest rates. Honestly, like when we were buying our house, we did not borrow this much money because I'm still on contract. So they only take my wife's income into account. And it was about 2020. And they were like, oh yeah, you could easily, we could lend you $850,000. And I'm like, on a teacher salary? They're like, yeah, that's how much we think you can afford. I'm really glad we did not buy an $850,000 house, by the way. Because we're like, yeah, that sounds like way too much money. Because, when our mortgage comes to renew in a couple of years, it's going to be pretty nightmarish as it is. But cheap money, like really low interest rates, right? The interest rate on my mortgage is comically low by historical standards. It's like 1.6%. It's absolutely insane. That drove up the price of housing because people could be like, get into bidding wars, right? It's like, oh, this house, it's probably only worth really about $250,000, but I'm going to offer $300,000. And then someone else offered $320,000 and the prices just went up and up. So cheap money, low interest rates drove housing prices all over the West. Canada in particular, and obviously Vancouver and the GTA were hit the worst by this. And then obviously, other cost of living increases more recently are going to have affected this as well. Huge rates of inflation. So that and the fact that people aren't establishing kind of romantic partnered relationships aren't getting married as much is driving more people to stay home and save money for a long time. Okay. Oh, thank you. You're so kind. What a nice comment to leave things on Friday. Sound dropping. Okay. I entirely know what that means, I'm sure. All right. Let's oh, you're talking about, okay, so that song is not mine. That is a song by an Edmonton-based group called Three Dead Trolls in a Baggie, who wrote a hilarious song called The Toronto Song. You should look it up. It's all about how Toronto sucks. And then Ontario sucks, and then every province in the country other than Alberta sucks. So, what is it? Saskatchewan is boring and the people are old? I think that's what it comes down to. Manitoba's population density is 4.1 people per square kilometer, and that's stupid. That's the level of intellect in this song. But yeah, the Toronto Song is a classic. All right, we'll see you on Monday. We're done with families. We'll start on education on Monday, and we will rattle through it fast. All righty. Yeah, you as well. Good luck on your last exam of the week.